Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. My guest today is Mona Harb. Mona Harb is a tenured professor of urban studies and politics at the American University of Beirut, where she is the co-founder and research lead at the Beirut Urban Lab. Her research investigates urban governance and city making in the context of dysfunctional states and disasters, and the role of urban activists in collective action and oppositional politics. She is the author of Hezbollah et Beirut, I can't read the rest of that title because it's in French, co-authored, she's also the co-author of Leisurely Islam Negotiating Geography and Morality in Shi'i South Beirut with Lara Deeb, Princeton University Press, co-author of Local Government and Public Goods, Assessing Decentralization in the Arab World with Sami Atallah, and co-author of Refugees as City Makers with Mona Fawaz at AUB, and more than 80 journal articles, book chapters, and other publications. Her biography is even more extensive than that. She's been involved in quite a lot of things, and so it's our great pleasure to have her here today. Mona, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you very much, Hassan, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And it's our pleasure to have you. So I wonder if we could sort of dive right in. So you've set up something. You're actually the co-founder of something called the Beirut Urban Lab, and I'm just sort of wondering, if you could tell us more about what kind of research this lab does, and how does it sort of contribute to our understanding of life in Beirut?
Sure. Thanks for asking this. So the Beirut Urban Lab is a research space that is interdisciplinary, and that's part of the American University of Beirut institutional setup. We're linked to the Faculty of Engineering and Architecture, and we established the space in 2018. We're 4 co-directors and co-founders, Mona Fawaz, Waida Al-Harisi, Ahmed Gharbi, and myself. And we are mainly interested in producing scholarship on processes of spatial production in Lebanon that would inform the region as well, and more broadly, questions related to spatial production in the global south and the world. We are very much driven by a vision of an ecosystem of change that would include the committed urban citizens of Beirut and Lebanon and other collectives who are working together to enable the making of just, inclusive, and viable cities. So particularly at the lab, my role is to work more on matters related to urban governance, like you said in the introduction, in the context of a dysfunctional state like Lebanon, where disasters and crises always happen in close conjunction to its dysfunctionality. And more specifically, I look at the meso level of exploration at the formal and informal actors that produce the built and the natural environment, with a focus more on the built environment. And I ask how their operations, their strategies, their urban policies, their urban actions across scales impact people's access to property, to urban services, to public space. And I do that both individually and collectively with my colleagues.
Yes, it's a very rich topic, because Beirut is, of course, obviously all cities have their sort of issues with terms of how people live, and people think a lot about that. But Beirut has undergone quite a lot of transformations. Like, even when I was trying to think of how to begin the conversation in terms of talking about Beirut's development, we could go back for quite a long time. It's an Ottoman port city. It starts off with, it sort of develops into this major port city in that part of during that period of time. We then see through the 20th century, we get all the way to, Beirut being the so-called Switzerland or the Paris of the Middle East. Beirut, not Lebanon, but Beirut specifically. You have all of those tropes in the 60s. You have a civil war in the 1958 to 61, if I remember correctly. But then you have the big one in 75 to 91. And so I was sitting there thinking, well, how do we even begin to start talking about this? But I've sort of begun my question with 1991, the reconstruction, because I think the reconstruction is one of the most critical moments for the development of Beirut. And I'm wondering if you could tell us about that period of time and what happened to the city during that period.
Sure. I'm glad you framed this historically. It's often forgotten that we have a heavy legacy to bear with, and that impacts enormously what we're living now. A lot of complex intermeshing of legacies and you highlighted the major ones. So let's I would say start after the end of the Civil War. So this is a 15-year civil war that tears the city apart. And again, I'm going to talk just about Beirut, but the impacts of the civil war are quite different on other parts of the country. But let's focus on Beirut for the time being. So we had 15 years of violence, 15 years of forced displacement that brings people into the city from various parts of the country. A city that already had seen a lot of displacement, more linked to rural-urban migration that relate to the events and the violence that you mentioned before, and that translate, I would say, in the built environment of that city in terms of the making of informal settlements as early as 1950s, but that get compounded during the Civil War. Also, the lack of accountability and I would say public enforcement of laws during the Civil War makes the fact that illegal constructions also multiply across major neighborhoods in the city, formal and informal ones. So a lot of additions on existing building, a lot of constructions that is illegal as well. So at the beginning of the 1990s, you have a city that's deeply segregated, fragmented, and divided. It's considered a divided city by the scholarship on the issue. So this is a division I want to highlight that's not only along sectarian lines and sectarian territories, because of course we had forced population displacement that pushed Muslim groups to move to Muslim areas and Christian groups to move to Christian areas, whereas the city was much more diverse prior to the Civil War. It's also, I would say, a division that's class-based. So we have a lot of division between neighborhoods that are rich and neighborhoods that are poor, although it's not as splintered as we see in other cities of the region or elsewhere in the world. Sometimes these juxtapositions are more intimate, I would say. So you would have a cluster of a neighborhood that's high-end, and next to it, you have very strong contrast. Beirut is a city of contrast. So when you have this, complex setup at the built environment level, you have a state that agreed to lead the post-war reconstruction phase through an agreement that was brokered in Ta'if in Saudi Arabia, and that brings together all the war militias back on the table. They remove their militia suits and they wear their civil suits, and there's no transitional justice that happens. It's an agreement to just turn the page and move on, and to just demobilize the militia. They should give their weapons to the state. Not all militias do that. That's another dimension of the story, but you have these militiamen that are now that are referred to as warlords very much, and that take up the reconstruction. Rafiq Hariri, the assassinated prime minister, takes the lead in that effort. He's a billionaire businessman who has been very interested in working in Lebanon even during the Civil War. And he comes and gives that impetus of rebuilding Beirut with flagship projects, namely Solidaire, the real estate company that is in charge of rebuilding downtown Beirut. And that's a private real estate company, a special one. And so, as you know, I'm leading to that reconstruction instead of prioritizing how to restitch and reconnect divided neighborhoods that have been fragmented and segregated by the war, focuses instead on spaces that benefit more the rich, the business elite, that is closely associated to the political elite and its infrastructure. So we invest a lot in highways that connect the city center to the airport, on large-scale developments, and we do it in a way also to bypass all the informal settlements, the poorer neighborhoods of the city, and to sort of concentrate that division that happened during the war, the social, economic, and political division and sectarian-based division. So in many ways, this is there's a political economy that shapes this Beirut post-war that is grounded in land financialization, that makes land a private asset rather than a public good or a collective good. And it becomes a tool through which we can capture rent, extract rent, and redistribute it to the people in charge and their networks. And the logic is both sectarian-based, and that logic of consociationalism that distinguishes Lebanon, but it's also very class-based. So these are the elites at the top that reap the benefits of the rents that come in. I don't know if I stay with that. Let me stop here and see if you want to take me in a different direction.
No, it's very good. It's we're sort of getting at it now, which is the 90s was, we all saw lots of money thrown around. And of course, this contributes not only to the consolidation of the elites in Beirut, who are obviously planning things out, it also gives rise to the political dynasties that would come in the 1990s. And the Hariris are a good example of this. Is the moment they come onto the stage. And they're quite an important role that they play, from the reconstruction to getting into politics. So could you perhaps tell us more about that connection?
Well, it's a difficult question because it's hard to trace these links. But actually, if we look at the people in charge of projects, contracts, bids, tenders, we are able to draw the architecture of these dynasties, and so we can see that there's a network around Hariri that gets shaped, a network around the Druze leader Walid Jumblat, a network around Nabih Berri as a leader, around the Christian leaders, and we see all these networks that also divide up, I would say, metropolitan Beirut. We're outside of the city proper, and we're connected very much to the strongholds of each of these leaders, where they have much more authority upon their territory, and where there's an agreement that, this is how we will divide the pie. You will allow me to do this in my territory, in my port, in my mountain, in my hills, and I will allow you to do this in yours, and I will take a port and you will take another. I will take care of that quarry here and extract the rent from it while you do the same in your region. And so the built environment and the natural environment, beaches, mountains, hills, the rivers, all these are room for extracting rent and to redistribute it primarily to the people in charge of these dynasties, but also to their constituents, and it trickles down to their NGOs, their foundations, their any social political structure they have put in place, formal or informally. We see that it becomes amplified in moments of elections. So the perks get distributed more at the time of election. After the municipal elections of 1998, municipalities start playing a major role in this architecture as well, by controlling that local level of redistribution. So it's a clientelistic, I would say, logic of distribution, where the urban space, the built environment, natural environment plays a major resource as it's conducive to rent. But let's also remember that there's a lot of capital flowing to Lebanon, to downtown Beirut. This is a moment of hope in the beginning of the 1990s in the Arab region, the time of the Oslo Accords that also positioned Beirut as a key city in the Arab region. A lot of trust towards Rafiq Hariri that will lead this reconstruction. Also a lot of his own friendships and networks with Arab Gulf capital and GCC capital more generally, that brings a lot of money to Lebanon. A lot of returnees, Lebanese diaspora that sees this as a moment of rebirth and that want to take part in this rebuilding. So a lot of people, Lebanese, that return and invest also in the country, and that that movement of investment will continue for a long period of time. This is, I would say, a period that's very euphoric in many ways. A lot of people believe in this moment of rebuilding, and the political, economic, spatial gets together in this affair. And we see now, like 30 years later, how it all collapses, how it was very much built on very soft sand.
Yes, and during this period, it's also quite complex because, as you've just mentioned, of course, there's lots of Gulf funding coming, which is financing a lot of this. But also, this is before 2004, I believe, when you still have Syria there. Syrians are still
Absolutely.
involved, and they're contributing to the politics. And I think what gives Beirut a sort of unique distinction from other cities in Lebanon is that in other parts of Lebanon, you see local municipalities playing a very large role in how the city is governed and structured. But in Beirut, it's much more the case. It's the national government is the local government. So what happens in Beirut is a national government. And so the dysfunction of the local government is a dysfunction of the national government. In
Absolutely,
the Beirut case.
Especially in the capital city. We see this a little bit also in Tripoli, in Saida and Sur to a lesser extent, but absolutely, there's a total overlay.
Yeah, and there's this sense as well, isn't there, that, it all sorts of, it holds together because it has all these people willing to invest in it. And the fact that you did have Syria there for so long, but then of course you have other events that come along a bit later, which we'll get into, such as the Syrian withdrawal and the war that happens with Israel in 2006. But I'm sort of wondering then, obviously we've talked about how the elites, re-merged in Beirut, and we've sort of alluded to how they disintegrated neighborhoods, but I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about how it pushed communities apart, or, what impact it had on local communities in Beirut.
Yes. So a few words on the presence of Syrian forces in Lebanon. So they've been here since the mid-1970s. They were invited by the Lebanese government, but it pretty much develops into an occupation, and a violent one in many ways. So when Hariri comes to power in the early 1990s, this is brokered by a Syrian-Iranian-Saudi deal that keeps Syrians in place until his assassination in 2005, after which there are huge uprisings that demand the departure of Syrian troops, which happen, and Syria leaves. So it's a very important juncture, I would say, in the political history of Lebanon, because the Syrians leave the grounds, and the grounds are pretty much open, and there are tensions that happen because the assassination also, there are fingers pointed to Hezbollah as a potential partner in the assassination. Some of its members have been indicted in the International Tribunal as well, but it creates on the ground a lot of tensions between Sunnis and Shia, which is a rift that did not exist before. In 2006, there's the Israeli war on Lebanon as well, that polarizes even more the communities and the streets. That ends up also with a small war in Beirut itself, waged against Sunni groups by Hezbollah, that divides even more communities and creates even more borders inside the city, and restricts neighborhoods and communities from each other, until 2008, when we have another deal brokered, this time in Doha, that brings Hezbollah to the center of political life in Lebanon for the first time ever in political history, and they take part in government. They were before in parliament, and they were shielded, I would say, from the Troika arrangement that happened. So, of course, all these geopolitics, these regional influences, these interferences, the interest of all these groups with their partners and the other states impact enormously life in the city, in its neighborhoods, among people. There are polarizations that happen within the same families sometimes, between people who are more or less aligned on certain leaders, between Sunni and Shia groups that never existed before, between Shia and other groups that never existed before. There's also the return of Michel Aoun around the same time that happens, the alliance with Hezbollah that shifts completely the landscape, and the political environment in Beirut. So all this has direct influences on communities in Beirut and on their daily lives. So I don't know to what extent you want me to go into that.
It's a very important area. There's a lot of areas to go into there, but I think it's also just important to highlight for the audience that when, for example, you get a government in Lebanon, when you actually do have one, you obviously have different ministries assigned often to different parties, and what that often would look like is when you have, let's say, someone from a specific party in a particular ministry, they will often take the resources within that ministry to redistribute to their own base. So it has a disintegrating effect in that way as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. The people, some scholars name that the hollowing out of state institutions. It has been a strategy for these ruling elites, these sectarian elites, to penetrate the state and to try as much as possible to take charge of key positions inside the state, even beyond ministries, at the level of director generals, for instance, to secure the continuity beyond the change at the ministerial portfolio. Because as you said, governments in Lebanon are more often resigned or just, operating as caretaker governments rather than actually operating, because of all these tensions between different groups and elites, and which fuels into the dysfunctionality of the state, which is actually a conscious dysfunctionality. It's a deliberate strategy, as other people have argued, that this is not, like an anomaly. On the contrary, this is a strategy of keeping as much as possible the state in a dysfunctional situation to be able to operate within its ambiguities better.
Yes, and also, I mean, as we're also thinking about this, I mean, even though you might be a constituent of a party and thus you will receive certain resources, it doesn't necessarily mean that you live very well. I mean, the astonishing thing is, Hezbollah is obviously part of the government and has been since 2008 at least. It does have a lot of resources, financing, it has entire networks, and you do sort of see the impact of that, because of course historically we'd look at areas like Al-Dahiyar in South Beirut, which traditionally was considered quite a poor area, but you do see a lot of development there happening, money flying around.
Sure.
But you still have a lot of people who are very poor despite being Hezbollah constituents. So how does this happen even with all of this?
Yes, this is a very important question. Thank you for raising it. We have a lot of inequality in Lebanon. It's a very capitalist system at its core, and like capitalism everywhere, it produces huge inequalities, especially in a context where we don't have an operative justice or judicial system that holds anyone accountable. So inequalities, it's encouraged to be a wheeler and dealer, as we say in Arabic. It's considered the Lebanese shatara. It's like you're better off if you're a wheeler dealer and you're able to get your ways through by having friends in the government, by having access to their networks and getting through everyday life. But this works for a few. I mean, so the many are not in a position to benefit in large parts of this political economic model of mainly that is rent-based. Most of the population is making do, although for a big period of time, because of the pegging of the Lebanese pound to the dollar and because of the banking system and the financial engineering that ended up being a pyramid scheme that fell on everyone's head. People lived for a period of time pretty generously and way beyond their means, thanks to the credit structure and the pyramid scheme structure that was put in place by the banking system. Yet, with all this, this is a country that relies a lot on remittances, and inequalities remain. So, as you mentioned, the example of Hezbollah and the territory they control, which is a very large territory, even bigger than municipal Beirut, Dahiyah Jnubiyya, on which I worked many years, you have a very vibrant middle class, and we documented its leisure activities, the pious leisure activities that they are characterized by in our second book with Lara Deeb. My second book with Lara Deeb, where we highlight the presence of this this very vibrant, active middle class that relies a lot also on money from remittances and returnees that come back to Lebanon after the liberation of the south of Lebanon in 2000. Let's also remember that key date. And that brings a lot of that money to Dahya and to its enterprises, cafes, restaurants, even small hotels, gyms, amusement centers, sports center, that are very much encouraged by the Hezbollah municipalities and its establishment at the expense of the poorer groups in Hezbollah's territory, in Dahya, that do not benefit at all from the goods and services provided by the municipality or the NGOs. Even NGOs, they are more supportive of these groups, but more at a, I would say, charity level of support rather than a developmental level of support. And the poor increase in numbers, while the rich, it's the typical setup of the rich becoming richer and the poor becoming poorer, which is completely now obvious in today's Lebanon, which is a very different landscape. But this started early on, where you see this inequality quite flagrantly in the streets of Dahya. But again, this is where urbanism is an interesting lens, but you see them, it's separated through invisible boundaries, invisible borders. The poor live on their own, the rich and the middle class live on their own. There are clear gated communities that are more or less bounded by walls, sometimes more than in some places more than others, if not their borders that are divided by streets, by infrastructure, by roundabout, where you have a clear dependency, where the rich depend on the poor to serve them and the poor are serving the rich, like we see in many other countries of the global south, where this relationship is very intricate. So it is translated in all the neighborhoods, including the ones where you have, Tripoli is another great example, and the north, where you have the richest people in Lebanon, billionaires that are from this region, and one of the highest poverty rates are in the north of Lebanon.
Yes, and to sort of think about it, even when we talk about, say, middle-class people, to be middle-class in Beirut today is obviously still better than being poor, but it's not a great existence, is it? Because you don't have, for example, 24/7 electricity. You have to rely on generators still, which prices for that go up. Currently, you can't withdraw a lot of money from your own bank account, even if you have it.
Sure.
So there's all sorts of ways in which, basic services don't exist, and it's quite dysfunctional.
Absolutely.
And, it's these billionaires and so on that make more money because of the dysfunction.
True. So the dysfunction of the state in terms of provision of basic services, potable water in our homes, electricity in our homes, and even businesses. This is a huge cost on industries and small and medium enterprises. When you don't have electricity, they have to secure electricity through other means and pay for gas and diesel to operate their generators. This has been the case even before the economic and financial collapse that we have. We have always been promised electricity. The government received millions of dollars in aid from international organizations and aid and grants, and nothing was done. On the contrary, the electricity cuts got worse and worse over time, up until 2019 even. Nobody drinks from the water that comes to our homes. Everybody buys bottled water or drives very far to fill the gallons and come back home if they don't want to pay for it. Everybody has a B system and a C system for electricity. Now we've become expert in solar panels and inverters and lithium batteries. A lot of homes have installed those or have purchased their own smaller diesel generators, so they don't depend on the one in the building or in the neighborhood. So the Lebanese have been accustomed to this since the civil war, and sadly, now they're accustomed to that without a civil war because of the collapse of state services I'm not even mentioning health and education, which is a catastrophe. If you don't have a private insurance, you might as well die at the door of hospitals. We don't have access to medication. So only the privileged with networks and money are able today to get access to these services. It was way better before 2019, but still with a lot of preferential treatment if you had money and if you're middle class and above. And again, as you said, the middle class in Lebanon is a small middle class. It's not the majority of the population. So we never have numbers because we don't do census. We don't know who lives where and how to be able to provide policies for them, because there's no interest really in providing policies for people and serve them as a government. The interest is more to maintain power and to redistribute the rent that comes from being in power to the constituents. So it's very hard to say what was the middle class made of before 2019. But what we know now is that a lot of the middle class has become lower income. I'm thinking about the teachers, the nurses, the public employees, all the people whose income is in Lebanese pound, which is now completely devalued, who lost their money in the bank, a bank that attracted them to put the money there because of interesting interest rate, and the banking sector that had been praised for years to be a safe banking sector. You even have expats that invested in the banks in Lebanon, even foreign Arab people who invested their money in the banks because of that image of the Paris of the Middle East, the secrecy law of the banking sector that protects also people with dubious money were interested in placing their money in Lebanon, and it all collapsed on their heads, except if you had a big wasta with people in charge. We know that some people managed to remove their money from the banks, but 90% of the people lost their savings, and it's a impoverished society today with more than 80% who are considered to be poor. I think 20% of them to be considered extremely poor. That's the latest numbers from ESQA.
Yes, and obviously on top of all of this, you had 2011, you had the Arab Spring, and then, of course, the beginning of the Syrian civil war, and Syrian refugees come in. So as we were sort of mentioning, you've got these sorts of both visible and invisible borders between communities that have come into existence and sharpen over time. But now you have the appearance of all of these Syrians. And so what sort of impact does all of that have? What's life like for the Syrians who come in, and how does the urban environment of Beirut and its invisible borders impacted by the appearance of Syrians?
Yes, that's a major issue. So let's first remember that Beirut is a city of refuge. It has been a city of refuge for a century, if not more. Let's remember that in the 1920s, even before the creation of Lebanon, Beirut hosted Armenians who were fleeing the Turkish genocide at the time, and came and, aided by the French Mandate forces, they were housed in camps at the border of the city of Beirut in what has become today Burj Hamoud, the major Armenian neighborhood in the city. Later in 1948, after the occupation of Palestine by Israel, Palestinians also came to Lebanon and built Hamra, one of its more fancy and known neighborhoods for its cosmopolitanism. They also invested in the banks of Lebanon at the time. In the 1950s, we also saw Syrians coming to Lebanon, and some Iraqis who were fleeing nationalization policies in their countries, and for whom Lebanon, and Beirut specifically, was a safe haven. So we had rich Syrians coming in with their capital, investing in a lot of sectors in Lebanon, including restaurants and hotels, and who also produced the city and its economy. So there are waves of migration that make the city, and it's important to remember that. Now, the displacement of Syrians in 2011 and beyond is a major one in terms of scale and numbers, and in terms of rapidity. It happens very quickly. Nobody expects that. And because of the presence Syrians, and I forgot to mention that we also had a lot of Syrian workers that come to Lebanon during the civil war, and that helped also the rebuilding of Beirut after the war. Syrians workers are the people who built Solidaire, who built all the high rises in Lebanon and in Beirut. So they work very prominently in the construction sector, and it was part of the deal of the occupation of Syria and Lebanon to open up the market for Syrians to come and work in Lebanon and send remittances back to Syria. So because you had that presence of workers, it was relatively facilitated for their families to come and join them, because they already had homes they were renting, little spaces that they were staying in agricultural lands, construction sites, or even buildings where they were concierge and natur, as we call them in Beirut. So, so the flow happens easily because of these networks that exist and that pre-exist the war in Syria. And in addition to villages that move as they are to certain regions in Lebanon, depending if they're pro-regime or anti-regime, they would move away from areas where Hezbollah controls or you know, Sunni, or that are under Sunni control. So it's a complex geography of displacement. In Beirut itself, they come and rent apartments in dilapidated buildings that are cheap, affordable, and of course landlords abuse this, raise the prices, make money out of this. There are many in the same apartments. So the people with more money, the Syrians with more money, rent or buy apartments and fancy homes, put their children in private schools. Some even invest in businesses. So we have a little bit of transformation in some neighborhoods in Beirut. Hamra is one of them. Again, it's a neighborhood that attracts a lot of migrants and displaced people historically. So today, Hamra is very transformed by the presence of Syrians, and it's a very different commercial activity than what it used to be before the Syrian influx. However, the government does not receive them happily. It's a government that does not help their integration in the economy and in the society unless they have money. So that makes it a bit easier, and yet there's still a lot of problems with banks. But if you're a refugee, in the sense that you don't have enough capital to invest and to survive on your own, you're not very welcome. You will be, you won't get papers that will facilitate your residency and your work. You will be surveilled and policed, and you will be criminalized, and you will be controlled in terms of your mobility. You could be stopped at checkpoint. You could be parked in a police station in jail for a few days and then thrown out. So in many ways, the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, or Syrian displaced more generally, are not welcomed and not treated as with rights unless they have money. As I said, it's they're also scapegoated. They are accused of all the problems in Lebanon. The narrative at the highest level is that it's their fault. Give us money. We're preventing them from going to Europe. You are supposed to give us money to host them. Of course, I'm generalizing. The public school system does take in Syrian children and teaches them first the Syrian curricula, then they teach them the Lebanese curricula even. But it's a complex, layered practice. Overall, it's a lot of stigmatization and discrimination. Yes, and policing.
Yes, it's quite interesting actually, because obviously there's the Syrian curriculum you just mentioned in schools and the Lebanese curriculum, which adds another layer because there's obviously multiple Lebanese curriculums as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, very complex matter there.
Yes, and the other important aspect as well is that, it's not just that Lebanon is hosting refugees, it's also, involved in the war in Syria, apart from obviously Hezbollah's intervention. But a lot of Syrian elites, especially in the regime, were using Beirut to trade with the rest of the world, and that was financing the regime as well. So it has all sorts of these connections. And now, of course, there's a big wave to deport refugees. So
yes, I mean, there are several waves every few months. One can probably trace it to when the government wants to divert attention from its failures. There's a discourse that criminalizes refugees and says they need to go back home. We've hosted them enough. We're not forced to deal with them. They're doing a lot of problems in Lebanon. They're stealing our jobs, etc. So now there's another wave of deportation. Yes.
I wonder though also, so we've sort of started talking about pre-2009 and post-2019, sorry. Where you obviously have an outbreak of protests, which initially was related to the WhatsApp tax, but it sort of snowballed into a general protest against the governing elites, and obviously that goes on for quite a long time. And the government starts to crumble under that, but then you have the financial collapse, and then of course 2020 you have the Beirut port explosion. And so I'm wondering, all of these events, what impact that actually had on Beirut as a city?
That's a topic that I get very emotional over, because all these, the uprisings of 2019 were another euphoric moment, I would say, in the history of the city. It's a very special moment for Lebanon, I would say, and Beirut in particular, but not only. And I think it's a particular moment for Beirut because Beirut during the uprising was connected with Nabatiyeh, with Tripoli, with Jal al-Dib, with the Shwayfet, with other centers where uprisings were happening. And it was a unique moment in the decentralization of this revolutionary stance by people who were fed up with that system that keeps oppressing them and extracting them and preventing them from having access to rights and to a dignified life and a dignified life for their children. So that was, I would say, an amazing moment. I was in the street with my students. We did teach-ins. We parked in the streets for a long time. We claimed our rights to a better life in this country and in the city as a symbol of the country, as you said before. But we were then completely repressed by counter-revolutionary forces that made sure that this uprising was demonized as being linked to foreign forces, embassies, foreign funding, and that was violently repressed by shooting at the protesters. It was also very much contained by the economic and financial collapse that started at the time, the locking of our money in the banks, the inability of getting our money out of the bank, and shortly after, in March 2020, the pandemic, that was a great excuse for the government to impose an emergency law and ask everyone to stay home and police everyone that would go in the street. And a few months later, in summer, the explosion that exposed again the criminal state that rules the Lebanese people. And when we mobilized again against that state, we were again repressed very violently in the street in August 8th. And sent back home and a lot of people went to prison, were arrested and went to prison. A lot of people lost their eyes at the time because the police shot people in the eyes and in their chest and even killed victims. So this is a regime that's very keen on reproducing its power and not letting its power clinch, and the city suffered from that. I mean, 1/3 of Beirut was destroyed by this explosion. Its historic city-centered neighborhoods, the oldest, the richest neighborhoods of the city, these are the parts that people who know Beirut cherish. This is where we take family and friends when they come to visit us, to walk in the streets of Gemmayzeh, Marim Khail, in their stairs and under the trees that are there. It's a very special urban fabric for every Lebanese person and every visitor to Lebanon. So it was a major shock for everyone who was in Beirut. It was a major shock for people like me, my generation, who were witnessing another disaster, another reconstruction that we had to undergo. For me, it was another one after 2006, a lot of déjà vu, a lot of like, this is now we have to hold ourselves together and struggle again and and try to assist the reconstruction and recovery process. It's very hard psychologically to find the strength to do that when you see that it's going to happen yet again, and in all impunity. Nobody is going to get held accountable for the mistakes that led to that explosion, for the negligence. Actually, it's really callous negligence that led to that, at the minimum, if not a criminal negligence as well. So it takes a lot from people to hold themselves together and engage back in that recovery. Also, because of the collapse of the economy and because of the explosion, a lot of people lost their homes, their businesses, their enterprises, and decided to just leave Lebanon and emigrate. And we lost a lot of colleagues, a lot of friends, a lot of colleagues at university, a lot of friends with whom you have built networks in the city left. So it's a city that is now also a lot orphan from people who love it. This was not, just emigration. This was exile. A lot of people talked about a forced exile, that they needed to leave to secure a place for their children, to secure income, to pay for their parents who had no income anymore, and they had to support them. So the departure of these people from the city, a lot of them middle class, educated, highly skilled, is also a major loss for the city and for its potential recovery after all these episodes of crisis and disaster. So Beirut is a very impoverished and sad city. And the contrast today is huge in terms of, I always talk about its amazing beauty still against all odds. So we are during springtime, so the light is magnificent. You have views on the Mediterranean and sunsets that are breathtaking. The bougainvillea and the jasmine and the gardenias are blooming, and you smell them as you walk in its street. But you also have garbage piling up. You have homeless and beggars and children begging you every time you walk, and it's in the streets of Beirut. Shops are closed and deserted. The city is dark at night. There's no electricity. You see this level of impoverishment, which is hugely violent to humans walking in the streets, that is contrasted with people with a lot of money in clusters of the city that are still surviving their wealth and gating even further behind their gates to protect themselves and their lifestyles from what's happening on the other side of the street. Even, like vigilante police that's protecting certain areas against poverty and against perceived threats of migrants, refugees. Of course, we criminalize the vulnerable and the poorer when we do this, but we don't criminalize the real thieves. Even when they are indicted, they're still roaming our streets and our restaurants, and they're still in a position. We protect those, but we criminalize people who speak against this immunity, and we criminalize the refugees and the poor.
Yeah, and it's kind of important also to highlight for the audience when you talk about historical areas in Beirut. I mean, Beirut is already a place where it's not very good at preserving its own heritage. It tears a lot of things down, like historical building, architecture gets torn down. Well before all of this, it was happening.
Absolutely. We tore a lot of our architectural and urban heritage over the years. We do it systematically. What has been preserved is in ways thanks to the civil war. It's been abandoned, so you have a lot of decrepit and dilapidated modern architecture buildings in some areas that are still there, and that are there because of inheritance issues that block them. But the heritage of the Ottoman period, it's not that many. We made sure to destroy that. Solidaire preserved some of the heritage, but destroyed also a big part of it. And so the areas of Jemaizeh and Mari Mikhail were among the heritage that was preserved and also gentrified. So what was preserved was turned into boutique hotels, fancy restaurants, posh restaurants, bars and cafes. So it maintained these buildings, but it also gentrified a lot these neighborhoods. So this is also gentrified areas of the city. We do have some heritage left in the pericenter in the areas of Bashura and Za'al Blad and Ain Mraisi. That's not yet totally gentrified, but that is in a very poor shape, that is not maintained and that is crumbling. So that's very much amenable to demolition and to being replaced by, new modernist buildings. And that's, if we consider that heritage, that's the French heritage, but we can also think about heritage in other layers. And that heritage is I would say, more maintained in other parts of Beirut and Lebanon, but that's a different discussion.
Yes, indeed it is. But you obviously teach at American University of Beirut. Mm-hmm. You also run this Beirut Urban Lab, and you're getting through a new generation of Lebanese, people who are students, activists, emerging scholars, a new generation. So what are the things they're sort of interested in, and how do they want to sort of engage with urban politics, and how are their ideas different from the last generation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Yes, I mean, my fight is through very much my role at the university, teaching generations of students, making them much more conscious of the dynamics I've shared with you here on the podcast, and much more aware of their role. I teach architects and urbanists, so their role as professionals in playing, I would say, an active part in enabling more social justice, more spatial justice, and more environmental justice in the city. So we do that in several ways. And I would say I was taught by a generation of urban scholars that focused a lot on heritage protection and revitalization, actually. That was a main thematic that was being professed in classrooms. My generation, we were taught abroad, and we were made much more conscious of critical urban studies concepts, I would say, that I shared many of them with you today. So the way we teach our students is actually to make them more aware about the political economy of cities, the role of power in the production of a city that benefits the rich at the expense of the poor, and we make them aware of their role in trying to limit the influence of financialization of the city. So the new generation have become quite aware of their role in protecting rights to the city, to a just, inclusive, diverse city, in promoting values of social justice and environmental justice. So a lot of them organized in NGOs, in collectives, research collectives, small think tanks, even in university platforms. The Beirut Urban Lab is one of them, and we collaborate with others. And I would say that there are about two generations now of scholars, professionals, activists, young students, even alumni, that form what we refer to as this ecosystem of change that is mobilizing regularly in campaigns against projects and policies and programs that are advanced by the state to privatize the coast. So we mobilize to stop this project that's going to take the coast away from people. We stop against a highway that's going to cut across a neighborhood and across the greenery in that neighborhood and that heritage in that neighborhood. We campaign for the opening of the largest park in Beirut and other public spaces in Beirut, because we believe in the role of public spaces to bring people together and increase interaction in a city that has been divided for decades. We also campaign for soft mobility and walkability instead of opening more highways and more roads. So campaigning for public transportation and walkable modes of transportation instead. We also campaign against the demolition of heritage when this happened, and the restriction of public spaces. And any threat to the natural environment, like the building of a dam, the extraction of stones and quarries, the removal of heritage-related landscape heritage dimensions as well. So we campaign a lot to try to stop things rather than put things in place. We succeed occasionally in stopping some of these projects. Sometimes we fail and we are unable to do it. The wins that these activists and the protesters have are there. There are wins, but there are little wins, not big ones. A lot of the big projects continue against the wants of these activists. Lately, in the recovery of the neighborhoods affected by the blast, this ecosystem of actors mobilized big time to recover the neighborhoods in the absence of a state that launched any process of reconstruction. This is a very different reconstruction than the one we've seen before. We don't have a political party leading it like Hezbollah rebuilt Dahieh or rebuilt the south of Lebanon. We don't have a rich businessman who led to lead the reconstruction like Hariri did for downtown Beirut. So this is a reconstruction that was mostly led by these activists and these NGOs, and it led to relatively, I would say, positive returns. The neighborhoods today are inhabited partially again. The enterprises and the restaurants have reopened. There's life back in the street. There's a bit of public life. There are festivals now happening again. So it's a reconstruction that has been homegrown, that has been led by its people. And in that sense, it gives you a bit of hope that this generation that we're teaching, that we're mentoring, that we're trying to support as much as we can, is able to perhaps make a difference in the years to come.
And my last question then, obviously now thinking about the future a little bit, what do you think the most important or urgent issues in regards to the future do policymakers and scholars need to address with regards to all of this?
Well, I think it builds very much on what I said before. Land in Lebanon is very much seen as through its exchange value, not its social value. It's a financial asset. We really need to turn this around and make sure that we look at land and other public resources, natural resources and built resources through the lens of the commons and the collective, and think about how to preserve and protect those for the generations to come. We need to reclaim the lands that have been financialized. We need to reclaim the downtown of Beirut to make it a collective downtown owned by everybody, not gentrified and exclusive and just restricted to a few. We need to make sure that the public domain is reclaimed by all people of Lebanon, not only the Lebanese, all people who dwell and live and work in this place and invest in here and try to reclaim these lands back. That's the most crucial issue, I feel. And for that, we need an independent judiciary system to hold the criminals who have usurped these lands accountable. We need fair elections that will bring people to the municipality and to the parliament, and who would be able to gain back their roles and their role in a fair system of decision for what has been lost.
Mona Harb, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversation.
Thank you, Osman, for having me and for giving me that space.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.